Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of For What It's Nerd. We are back after a 1 week hiatus due to Jedi Survivor, but we are back with a bang, so to speak. Guardians of the Galaxy 3 came out the middle of this week, the 3rd of May in the UK, the 5th of May, I think, everywhere else. But it is a good movie. I'm very happy with this movie. I think it's got a lot of good parts. Now, I will say, and this is one thing that I think is very important to me, is that I don't think the movie is as big as everyone is making out. It's a good movie. It's a solid movie. A very good, capping piece to the Guardians property, but also a very good Marvel movie, a good MCU addition. I will say, though, yes, it isn't epic, and that's a good thing and a bad thing, and we'll kind of discuss that. So let's start with the bad thing. For me, I felt like this movie, for being the capping stone, could have been more spectacular, more large, more it felt like in parts it didn't have quite the impact that I was wanting. I'm not saying that it doesn't have impact, it definitely does. I cried, as most people will have watching this movie. I think some of its pacing had issues though, and I think generally this movie was relatively contained, and that's okay, and that's the good thing as well. Sometimes these Marvel stories don't need to be huge, they don't need to be big, they can be small. But for me, as someone who's watching a Guardians of the Galaxy movie, Galaxy being kind of the big part there, I feel like this movie, how do I put it? I feel like this movie could have been the Guardians special, if that makes sense. I feel like this could have been a really good special, and then I feel like the movie could have been something else, or in addition to that, a continuation of that storyline. I feel like this was a very weird movie to have Rocket as the star of as well, by the way, because I think Rocket is a great character, don't get me wrong, and I think Rocket does carry the piece. I think the Rocket scenes and learning about Rocket's past actually is good. I think the backstory, admittedly, is, jarring when it's going back and forth between the rest of the movie, but I do think it's good. I do think it's a sound story. It's a very interesting story and a very interesting villain with the High Evolutionary as well. But I think Rocket being in a coma in the present of the movie, was very weird, and it created a situation where for most of the movie it wasn't really like, you didn't really have the main character, so to speak. And don't get me wrong, a lot of the other characters had a lot to do in this. Everyone kind of had their moment. Nebula was a very big welcome addition to this set of, like, this time round. We had a lot more with Nebula, and it was very good. It was very fun, very enjoyable to have Nebula show up and to be a big part of this. Not show up, but you know what I mean, be part of this team and be there in a big way. We haven't had that with Nebula before. She's always been kind of ancillary to the rest. But also seeing Mantis evolve and seeing the continuation of Mantis' story from the holiday special was great. Seeing Drax get kind of some resolution at the end of this movie. And Groot didn't really have much to do in this one, but understandably, Groot didn't need that much to do in this one. There wasn't really anything to kind of expand with Groot this time. And that's okay, that's fine. Obviously, as well, Star-Lord got his dues. He was definitely like the core protagonist in this, and I think he had his moments, and obviously it's clear by the post-credit scenes that Star-Lord will be back in some capacity, which is very interesting, especially because him and Gamora did not get back together. I'm wondering if we're perhaps leading towards Star-Lord being part of another team or an Earthbound team, or whether he's going to have some kind of cosmic adventures of his own, but centered around Earth. Is he going to be involved in some kind of Kree and Skrull situation? Who knows? Who knows what's going to happen with Star-Lord going forward? But that is very interesting, as well as the new iteration of the Guardians, including Kraglin, Groot, Rocket, Adam Warlock, and Phyla-Vell, as well as Cosmo the dog, which Cosmo was actually a really interesting, fun little part of this movie. I'm very interested to see more Cosmo. Cosmo's a cool character. Obviously, I mean, who doesn't love a dog that talks? But also Phyla-Vell, very interesting addition, though it is different from her comics counterpart, because Phyla in the comics was a Kree character. So in this, it looks like she's different. I don't know how much that's going to impact her character. There is some discourse right now that is detracting from her being added, because they feel as if, because she's a younger character being added, and also an LGBTQ character being added, that there is a little bit of a mesh there in which Marvel is continuously adding LGBTQ characters as younger characters to avoid having to really deal with that dynamic, so to speak. I would argue that's not the case. I'd argue that what they're trying to do is promote longevity in a cast that arguably, let's say the next Guardians isn't until 2027, 2028. Like, she's going to be a lot older by that point. And potentially they'll recast her, even depending on when they're doing it, if they do a timeline jump, etc. I think that's kind of the thing that you need to be aware of here, is that yes, it does look that way on surface. Yes, it does look that way on paper. They've done it with America. They've done it with the Maximoff kids, technically, but that was because of story. That was like literally because of story. They needed to be conceived, so to speak. But I think it's more to do with the fact that, you need this to be a franchise that lives, so to speak, and you can't. They learned the hard way with some actors that if you cast them at like middle age, by the time you're finished with them, they're entering older ages, so to speak. That's not to say that like you can't have an older character. You can, but you know what I mean. You know where I'm coming from with that. So I get the point. I do understand the sentiment. I do think it can kind of look that way, but I think it's more to do with longevity of franchise, and that those things will eventually be dealt with in these movies when they become relevant to the plot. For example, Moondragon will likely show up eventually. I don't know how they're going to do that now with Drax, because Moondragon is in the comics Drax's daughter, but that could be very easily rectified. That could be very easily added into a new movie, a fourth Guardians, or a different Guardians, or even a different project altogether. That could easily be done. So, other than what I've said so far, what else did I think of the movie? I will admit, I don't think the music was as great this time. There were two that really stood out. Is it No Sleep Till Brooklyn? I'm sorry if I'm butchering the title. I'm really sorry. But that paired with the fight scene was one of probably the best fight scenes in the MCU. Like sans like the Endgame battle, etc. And the Florence and Machine, I forget the name of the song at the moment, but the ending song, the kind of like dancing ending celebration song, that really hit. That was really good. Especially because you saw kind of Drax dancing, etc. You see a lot of character development through actions in this movie rather than words, which is really well done. James Gunn to show things as much as tell things, which a lot of people feel like they have to be told things. I think it's nice to see it sometimes as well. So that's really like a really those two were the really standout ones. I feel like the rest kind of fell away. Movie like music wise, but camera wise, I think there's some really good shots in this, especially with Adam Warlock. There's some really good moments where they kind of like use the camera in a certain way to kind of almost hint at his powers, to talk about his powers. A specific example is the kind of the hand of God moment where him and Star-Lord touch fingers and he saves Star-Lord. It looked like the way they've like moved the camera for that was actually really it was like you were seeing a totally different perspective all of a sudden. It was a big shift in the camera, and it was quite cool, actually. There was some moments like that. I think there was one with Adam very early on in the movie during the initial fight with Adam. But I will say, on Adam, I do think Adam was underutilized. I think for a movie that kind of suggested that he might be a big part of the villainy in this movie, and then kind of subsequently change over to being a good guy, he didn't really get much. And even less so than him was his mother, Aisha. I think Elizabeth Debicki was really underutilized in this movie. I do feel like there was kind of no point I feel like it would have been just better if they didn't have the subplot with how do I put it? If they had the subplot with the Org Corp be like intertwined with Adam and like and Aisha, if that was like a sovereign facility, I think it would have been better if it was like all those people were sovereign. And I feel like it would have been more interesting to see them having a little bit more time. I also feel like Aisha should have had a moment with the Guardians to say like, F you guys for what you did to me and my society. I feel like would have really rounded off rather than the kind of blobbo thing-looking suits that Nathan Fillion appears in. Which, don't get me wrong, it was nice to see Nathan Fillion, especially in a role that he was actually on screen for. But I do feel like it would have been better if that had been a Sovereign facility, because it would have added to the Sovereign story in this movie. Now, don't get me wrong, otherwise, I think the movie was really good. I think character development was great. I think we leave it a very positive note. I also think it was very brave of James Gunn to, as I said before, leave the Gamora Star-Lord relationship at the place it was, to not reinvigorate that flame and potentially leave them to other stuff. I don't know if Gamora's returning. I don't think she is, because we've heard a lot of talk about Zoe Saldana kind of being done with the role. Same with Drax. We don't really know about Pom Clementiev at the moment. I butchered her name. I'm sorry, Pom. We don't know what's happening with her at the moment. As regards her return. Karen Gillan hasn't really said anything either. So those two could return at some point. It seems like Rocket and Groot will. It seems like they're going to be like maybe part of this new Guardians. I don't know when we would get a new Guardians, if and when and how that would happen. Obviously, they'd be looking for a new director, considering James Gunn is now helming DC going forward, unless they do it where they kind of have James Gunn as a special representative for the movie alongside whoever ends up directing it. But it is interesting. It's a closing time for the MCU, I think, because that was the last major franchise that hadn't had, from the beginning bunch, that hadn't had its third movie. Like, that's like this is a 10-year arc that is now over. This feels like the last vestige of what the MCU was way back at the beginning, which is crazy. And exciting too, because it means what do these characters go on to next, especially the Star-Lord thing. I'm very excited to see what Star-Lord goes on to next. But yeah, I think this is a very good movie. I think it's got a lot going on for it. I think there's a lot of heart-wrenching moments. I think you have a lot of heart-wrenching beats. You have a lot of how would I put it, heart in this movie. I think whilst I dislike the fact that this movie wasn't slightly more epic, I think actually this movie allows us to reevaluate feelings and characters and ideas a lot more than other movies have in recent MCU kind of time, so to speak. Like, opposite to Quantumania, and I like Quantumania. I don't think it's great. I do think it's okay. I don't think it's a popcorn movie. This one isn't. This one has a little bit more. This one has a little bit more going on for it. It has a little bit more thought-provoking moments. It has actual conflict between characters that matters as well. For example, Mantis and Nebula have a little bit of back and forth, and it doesn't really get reconciled, which is a shame. I feel like that could have done with a little bit more, building of their relationships, especially generally Nebula with the rest of the crew could have been expanded more. I actually think Nebula didn't speak to Rocket once in this movie. Like, she spoke about him, but not to him, which is weird, because I feel like they had the most empathy for each other outside of Star-Lord and Rocket's kind of dynamic, which is a shame. But, these things, there's only so much you can put in I think it was a 2.5-hour movie. There's only so much you can put in those. And it was a good movie and a sound movie. I don't really have much else to say on it other than that. I think we're excited to see where this goes next. I think there's a lot to take away from this movie as regards how the MCU can go forward. I hope that this success of this movie and the introspection on what matters in Marvel movies, apart from just spectacle, because I think I know I'm saying that I would like more spectacle, but I think the separation from spectacle every now and again is a good thing. I do think they're both worthwhile. So I'm hoping that, despite me not liking the lack of spectacle in this one, which I think could have done with a little bit more spectacle, if that makes sense, I hope that they learn a lesson from this, that people like something that's a little bit more nuanced. Does that make sense? So what I'm trying to say is that even though I personally don't feel like Guardians needs to be, like, I think it could have done with a little bit more flourish, so to speak, I can recognize and appreciate the fact that it didn't, and I think that is beneficial for the MCU as a whole, regardless of my fact that I think Guardians could have done with a little bit less of it. That makes sense? I think it makes sense. Oh, also one thing I did forget to mention this. Humor. The humor in this movie, I would argue, is probably the best of the Guardians movies so far. Um, there's a part where I forget her name off the top of my head, but James Gunn's wife is making a cameo as a controller in Orgel Corp, and she gets shot in the leg by Gamora, and the unholy scream that she lets out was just hilarious, like brilliant. Like she's shouting, "I've been shot! I've been shot!" It was so funny. There's a lot of funny parts in this movie, and it's very, very, very well done. I do think, like I say, it's the funniest of the three. But in terms of my ranking for the others, I actually think, and I know a lot of people will disagree, I think 2 still comes out as the best movie for me personally, with 1 coming just after and 3 being on the lower rung. And that's but that is because I think all Guardians movies are good. I think this is probably the most rounded out, fleshed out franchise compared to, like, I know a lot of people say the Captain America trilogy is the best trilogy. I now think probably the Guardians trilogy is the best trilogy. So whilst I'm putting 3 on as the worst of the 3, I think it's actually arguably still great and probably still on the top 10 MCU movies, probably. Yeah, so I did enjoy this movie. I do think it's a good movie. I think it's got a lot going for it. I think there's some things I would have done better. I also think there's a lot of good humor in it. I think the music wasn't to my taste this time, but I think it could grow on me potentially. I think it has the potential to, and there were some good ones. There's a really good fight scene, really good character development, really interesting villain. It's sort of more maniacal than our usual villains, but that's okay. Sometimes it's okay to have a Saturday morning cartoon villain. And yeah, I think that's kind of where we're at with this one. So I won't overcook it. I won't over inflate what I think this movie is. I won't try and over justify why I feel the way I do. I think I've made some relatively controversial points. I think I've backed them up as best I can, and it's up to you guys to decide whether you agree, disagree. Potentially there's some things that you could shed some light on for me that you think might be better, might be a little bit more nuanced in their approach to the situation. I personally think this is a great movie. I just think it's not epic, and that's kind of my tagline for this one. Great, but not epic. Yeah. So with that said, thank you guys as always for watching. I hope you're having a great weekend. I hope you're having a great time, and we'll be back next week to discuss. Who knows? I don't know. I'm trying to kind of be a little bit more regimented in selection, but it's kind of hard. We could potentially talk about Star Wars Visions Season 2, but that will be a week later. So unless something happens between there and then, maybe we'll do that. Or we could do another book reading. Not book reading, but discussing what books I'm reading at the moment. This is what I mean to say. So if you guys are interested in any of those, let me know. Otherwise, again, as I said before, thank you guys as always for watching. Thank you guys for hanging out and listening. I always forget to say and listening. Thank you guys for watching / listening. Thank you guys for being here, and I'll see you.